usage of the term Islamicate in this sense of then Islamic accounts of the non-Muslim, then of of Buddha or indeed a but not necessarily of Buddhism. So I'm using this term that I came up with a couple of years ago, idolography, to be thinking about the ways in which the historical Buddha, let's say the Buddha of world religions, that kind of modern conceptualization, really kind of shifts quite early on in Islamic writings about non-Islamic religions. So in Islamicate writings, then shifts to being a generic idol, a and only actually really in surprisingly recent times, the late 19th and 20th century, do we have this wider Indo-Islamic and wider Islamic rediscovery in some cases, or in other cases, a real kind of first discovery that there is a historical and a specific religious figure, the Buddha, that lies behind 1,200 years of, let's say, kind of Islamic generalizations of a generic or Bud as an idol. Well, the initial puzzle for me that began this exploration of the Islamic language of the Buddha, or indeed of the but being the Persian, Turkish, etc. word for idol, as we'll talk about later. The initial puzzle came for me when I was actually working on a late 19th century Urdu account of Burma, modern Myanmar, written by a very educated Muslim scholar, a Maulvi, so someone who knew Arabic, knew Persian, knew Urdu, and traveled to Burma in the 1880s, spent at least a decade or maybe 20 years living there, and even learned the local languages, including particularly Burmese and the Burmese Tipitaka, the Burmese Buddhist canon. And yet he had no conception that there was a religion called Buddhism, that there was a historical figure called Buddha. He refers only to someone called Shin-Gotama. And what struck me then was that the highly educated Indian Muslim that was actually grew up in the region that we now know of as the region where the historical Buddha lived, in the regions of sort of around North India, sort of the Patna, Bihar, parts of UP, the regions of the historical Buddha's life and roamings, and yet left India and spent years within Burma with no conception of a Buddha, or indeed that this religion had anything to do with India, that this religion of Shin-Gotama, the Mazhabi Barma, the religion of Burma, as he calls it. So this led to a sort of a formulation then, a question which I formulated as, how did we get then from this generic language that any scholar of sort of Islamic writings about the Hindu or indeed Buddhist religions or various others, perhaps in Africa as elsewhere, will know of the generic language of what I call idolography, of the but in Persian, Turkish, etc., or of the Sanam, the idol in the Arabic or Arabicate, let's say, kind of languages of Islamic Africa. And I'm interested then in modern times, how did this generic term for an idol, whether but or sanam, the Arabic for idol, gain, or in some cases regain its specificity then, referring to a particular founder as a real historical figure of a very specific religion, not just some generic idol worship. So my premises in this project, as in my the book that it sort of is related to, How Asia Found Herself, was really about following the evidence, not to assume, I think has often been the case, that, well, Indian Muslims, Hindus, whatever, Indians somehow always had a folk memory or an intellectual memory or a sort of an archaeologically or site-specific memory of Buddhism and the Buddha, let alone in the wider Islamic world. I've been following the evidence, and not only following evidence that, okay, evidence of there is a medieval text, some of which I'll turn to, that seems to talk about the historical Buddha, Rashid ad-Din's Jami' at-Tawarikh as the most important case. I'm also interested in the evidence of the transmission of knowledge. So not just what I'll be calling the occasional breakthrough, a medieval breakthrough, an early modern breakthrough in a particular text, but evidence that such knowledge was then, such texts were copied and transmitted, and such knowledge was actually further handed down over time. I'm particularly interested, as one of my key premises, in the challenges of inter-Asian, intercultural, even sort of intra-Indian, cross-cultural knowledge, and the problems and the challenges, the barriers of languages, of different language groups, of course, different scripts, different writing systems, and the philosophical challenge that even in the case of my Indian Muslim who travels to Burma and learns to read the Burmese Buddhist canon, the problems in of commensurability. Even if you understand or try to understand a concept in another language you can read, how do you translate? How do you explain that? How do you make that commensurable and comprehensible in another language of another, let's say, kind of religious, philosophical, theological, cultural system? I'm particularly interested with regard to the Buddha then, in not only memory, historical memory, which obviously is a big field of historical or indeed of memory studies now in its own right. I'm really interested in the much less studied process of forgetting and historical forgetting. And thirdly then, or fourthly, another key premise of my recent work then have been flawed paradigms, what I call the Silk Road model of continuity, that people are always in contact along the Silk Road. There was somehow always this knowledge, and we can talk about the ancient and the medieval and the modern in some seamless way, rather than realizing the real disruptions and including long processes of disconnection and of forgetting what was perhaps once previously known to small numbers of people. Another flawed paradigm, then the back projection of later knowledge. In the 20th century, of course, many South Asian nationalists, Indian nationalists in particular, and indeed Iqbal, as I suppose proto-Pakistani nationalist, are very interested in the Buddha and write a lot about the Buddha as a key Indian figure. But this is really, and then it's assumed that, well, this was always known. But my other premise then is that we often back project. We assume that what was known circa 1900 was known even in 1850, let alone in 1500. So those assumptions and back projections of much more recent discoveries. And also then I'm pushed back against the assumption, the paradigm of cosmopolitanism, and then actually kind of, well, rather than assuming there's this cosmopolitanism that people are always, just because people live next door to one another or lived peacefully with one another, that they necessarily understood one another's beliefs or indeed theologies, let alone written languages in which their higher culture then, philosophical, theological, ethical, was expressed. So I turn then to, here I'll be looking at the language of, and indeed the evidence of theology and theological writings, rather than assuming, well, there's this cosmopolitanism in different times and places that, of course, people knew one about one another because they seem to have done later or something. So historiographically then, I'd sort of position my work, my book, How Asia Found Herself, and this talk today, in what I'll dub the new Islamicate intellectual history. The work of Stefan Kamola on Rashid ad-Din, then that very major Mongol period world history, the Jamia Tawarikh, the kind of collection, the summation of histories, which includes a famous section on the Buddha. Stefan Kamola's very careful manuscript-based and very contextualized study of that historian and that work of history. Ahmed Shamsi's work on the way in which modern, particularly Egyptian, modern Arab, 19th, early 20th century Arab editors and publishers rediscovered, as he put it, the Islamic classics, medieval Islamic works, and they rediscovered these works in a neutral sense, in collaboration, through a cooperation with Orientalists in Europe. Texts that had been fallen out of circulation among Muslims and Arabs themselves for centuries, even perhaps a millennium, were then rediscovered through print and indeed through cooperation, through working together with European scholars, qua Orientalists. Matthew King's work then, what I call now the New Eurasian intellectual history, broadening the scope, but I think within a sort of a similar methodological approach. Matthew King's recent work on the travelogue of Fa Xian, the early 4th century Chinese Buddhist pilgrim, and how his book was unknown outside China and really sort of only in the 19th century. I'll come on to this through a translation by Abu Ramoussat, a French sinologist, and then Ramoussat's translation into French and then the edition enables Mongolian, Tibetan, as well as sort of ultimately Indian scholars to realize, oh, there was this connected Buddhist world that then is actually only really sort of rediscovered through collaboration with European scholars, what I call a Eurasian circuit of intellectual discovery rather than Orientalist versus indigenous or some kind of false dichotomy that doesn't actually fit the evidence of the circulation of knowledge. And my own book then, How Asia Found Herself, looking at basically how West and South Asian, our Middle Eastern and Indian thinkers, scholars, writers in the 19th and 20th century came to understand, discover, occasionally rediscover the cultures of Southeast Asia, East Asia, and China and Japan, including then Buddhism. So what are we talking about in outline today then is, first of all, the Islamicate language of idols. I'll be whizzing through then medieval and early modern accounts, and then turning to this era of print then when we have various rediscoveries or indeed plain discoveries of Butts and Bud, of generic idols and the specific Buddha, both within South Asia, but also Middle Eastern and South Asian encounters and discoveries of Buddhism and Buddha in China and Japan as well. And what we'll see then is a slow, but much more rapid in the 19th, early 20th century, shift from the generic Butt, the generic idol, the term Butt, of course, being etymologically derived from the Sanskrit name for Buddha, but just taking on a life of its own then as a generic idol, and how that generic term gives way in the modern period to the realization that there is a historical Buddha, not just a whole series of generic Buddha idols. So the Islamic language of idols, well, the starting point, I think, both chronologically as well as conceptually then, was in the Quranic terminology of idols in Arabic, and indeed the Quranic narratives in which idols play an important role. So we have the Arabic singular sanam, or the plural asnam, or another lesser used term wathan and awthan, terms that are used in the Quran and in subsequent Arabic theological, legal, and indeed ethnographic and poetic writings that relate to the generic idol. And of course, this generic idol is broadly, of course, there are some later exceptions to this in poetic and the what I call the aesthetic, or sometimes the mystical idol. But from the Quranic and then the legal literature, these idols, these asnam and awthan, are seen in a very negative theological valence. These are the pagan adversaries then of Ibrahim, of Abraham, the first Hanif, the person who brings back monotheism to humankind. We also have post-Quranic, particularly from the Abbasid period, with those encounters with India, and the term Bud comes into Arabic and takes on an Arabic broken plural bidada. But again, this Bud becomes a generic figure, even though obviously derived from the historically specific Indian Buddha. Then by the 9th century then, or the early 9th century, we have a work of what I call idolography, the foundational work of idolography, of writing about idols, which is Hisham ibn al-Kalabi's his Kitab al-Asnam, the Book of Idols, describing a whole range of different idols, particularly focusing on those of pre-Islamic Arabia. And then by the Abbasid period in Baghdad and Iraq, Al-Jahiz, Al-Masudi, geographical writers, poetic writers. And by this time, then, Bud or Al-Bud is becoming a generic figure more so, and in a range of, let's say, kind of more belletristic, sort of aesthetic terms as well. In Ibn Shahriar's travelogue, then, Kitab al-Ajab al-Hind, the Book of the Wonders of India, then we have lots of asnams, lots of idols as well. A very major hagiographical work, Shahrastani's book, who dies in 1153. And throughout here, then, what we're seeing then is a mode of anti-idolography. And it's particularly important to recognize in the background to this. We have the very basic theological, but also the legal Islamic ban on what's called Sajd al-Sanam, the worship, or literally the prostration before idols. So again, it's about idols, but idols in relation to human behavior, of bowing down before them. So we also have then the emergence of Persian then, and this Islamic language of idols then in Persian, indeed a wider Persianate mode that influences, let's say, Ottoman Turkish, Chagatai, Urdu, etc., etc. And here then the term is but. We have early uses in the two poets of the Ghaznavid period, Farrukh Sistani and Masud Sad Salman. Masud Sad Salman is writing in Lahore, of course, in South Asia. And here now that the but, the idol, is very much a generic. It's just lost any sense of there being a specific figure here. I should also mention, we might be thinking then here, although Al-Biruni from the Abbasid period, Al-Biruni is writing in Arabic, of course, but he's accompanying Mahmud of Ghazni into India, learning a lot, one might say kind of in a cosmopolitan mode, learning a lot from Brahmins. But there too, in his chapter 11 of his famous book, Kitab, was it Fi Tahqiq al-Hind, the book of research on India, or book What is India, literally. In chapter 11 is this chapter on idols, on Asnam, in which he gives various individual names of particular idols that are worshipped in India, including one called Al-Bud. So we have a specific idol here, but here he writes in that chapter, Wa'ama sanam jin wa huwa al-Bud. And so onto the idol Jina, who is also Bud. So there's a sort of the loss of any sense that Buddha was a historical figure, that he was the founder of a separate religion, which is different from the religion of the Hindus, etc. So even as exhaustive a researcher as Al-Biruni has no sense then of the Buddha as being the founder of a separate religion, etc., etc. And indeed, we have to bear in mind that by this period in India itself, it can't be assumed that Al-Biruni's Hindu Sanskrit reading informants have a much closer idea themselves. We also have then, as the centuries go on then, a fuller aesthetic literature of idolography and a heroic literature of idolography in Sa'di's Somnatiya, the section of his great Bustan about the Somnath idol temple. We might have the celebration of idol breaking, which is, of course, a theme of various narrative Persian poems from the Delhi Sultanate, or indeed in beyond, in Sa'di, of course, writing in Shiraz in Persia. And we have then an aestheticization of the idol too. But nonetheless, the but has lost its specificity. In the 18th century, then, we have other works even written by Hindu Persian authors and poets, the hymn to Varanasi, written by Matan Lal Afrin, and studied by Stefano Bello. But here too, we don't have any, long gone is any sense of the Buddha or Buddhism as something specific. And similarly then within prose histories being written in Persian in South Asia. And again, I'd be happy to be introduce to any sources I've missed that kind of correct or complicate my narrative here. Now, many of you might be listening and say, oh, but what about the Jami Tawarikh then? What about the aforementioned Mongol era historian and Grand Vizier Rashid ad-Din, who includes in his summation, his compilation of histories, the Jami Tawarikh, his account of Shakyamuni, the Buddha, a very specific figure, Shakyamuni. And what about the well-known to scholars, not least through the work of Sheila Canby, these extraordinary illustrations then here of Shakyamuni? And we know from the work of various careful scholars over the decades of Carl Jahn and then more recently of Stefan Kamola that Rashid ad-Din is drawing upon knowledge from the specific Kashmiri scholar who tells him about, well, Kashmiri Buddhism rather than, let's say, the existence of Buddhism in China, Tibet, or among the Mongols, etc. And yet, this illustration only belongs in one Arabic translation, one manuscript, now in the Khalili collection, one particular manuscript. So we can't assume this visual knowledge was more widespread. It wasn't. And indeed, the Jami Tawarikh itself wasn't passed down and transmitted particularly widely, especially the chapter on India, in which the section on Shakyamuni, or Shakmuni, as he's called there in the Arabic and the Persian text. So for those who are interested, there it is there, Shakmuni. So again, we can't just assume this medieval breakthrough or this medieval lucid moment was transmitted and that this knowledge was available to later readers. So yeah, we have this section then on India, on the life and teachings of Shakyamuni, describing various hells and heavens of metempsychosis, reincarnation, tanasukh, a key theme among various Islamic historiographers and indeed for various Muslim writers on Buddhism when there is such a recognition of a theological system. But again, we can't assume that this was handed on for later centuries. As for Ibn Battuta, who's so often he's always the first reference of transmitting knowledge into the Islamic world of other parts of the world, including what we would think of perhaps as the Buddhist world, China in particular. Well, and indeed on Sri Lanka. It's worth bearing in mind that Ibn Battuta's section on Buddhist Sri Lanka, or Buddhist majority Sri Lanka, is entirely Muslim focused. And his section on China then, I will simply quote from the first lines of the chapter on China, from the third paragraph, quote, "The Chinese themselves are infidels who worship idols and burn their dead like the Hindus." And then he goes on, in every Chinese city there is a quarter for Muslims. And he goes on. So again, Ibn Battuta's focus on China is this is a language of idols. His closest point of comparison is with the Hindus of India, not that the recognition that this is a very separate, or indeed, not to mention Confucianism, but two very separate major religious, cultural, philosophical systems. And again, as with Sri Lanka, his major focus, even in China, is on the Muslims and the fellow Arab Muslims of China. Moreover, we also know from the more recent work, or the work in more recent decades of Japanese researchers, that Ibn Battuta's manuscripts were the only extant early copies or pre-modern copies of Ibn Battuta's text, which of course was written down in Tangier in Morocco. The only copies, the only manuscripts were all written in the Maghrebi, the North African Arabic hand, which is to say that there is no evidence whatsoever that the manuscript, the text of Ibn Battuta, was transmitted, copied outside of North Africa before the modern print discovery of Ibn Battuta which I'll be turning to later. So again, assumptions of the continuation of knowledge, even such as it was in Ibn Battuta's case. So we have other breakthroughs. Of course, there's a great early modern breakthrough in Mughal India with Abul Fazl's famous Ain Akbari under the Emperor Akbar, in which we have the identification of Buddha and Shakyamuni and him being located in India, specific to India. And of course, at Abul Fazl's disposal, then there were these huge state resources, including bilingual Sanskrit and Persian reading and writing munshis in imperial service. It's not clear, I don't think any research has been done on this that I could find, what Abul Fazl's sources were from at least my own look through. I didn't note him identifying sources. Maybe Rashid ad-Din, though I doubt it. Perhaps Hindu harissiographers, possibly. But again, the Ain Akbari, to my knowledge, wasn't transmitted in many manuscript copies thereafter. It's really in the mid-19th century that we have Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the great 19th century Muslim modernist, as in 1898. He issues a lithographic edition of it. So again, sort of we can't necessarily assume that Abul Fazl's really very thick state-intended sort of work of state compendia. It's a bit like assuming the Doomsday Book. Yeah, everybody had copies of the Doomsday Book. Well, we know they didn't. So again, sort of research on the transmission, the copying of this manuscript before the era of print needs to be done before we can assume that even Abul Fazl's breakthrough was known about. Similarly then, in the early 19th century, we have East India Company scholars sponsoring Persian writing munshis to travel in Burma and to write accounts of the religiosity of what we would now call of Buddhists in what's now Myanmar. And there are some manuscripts of these studied by Arash Khazani and Thibaut Dubert. But again, these manuscripts, the only copies that survive are been sitting in the library of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in Calcutta for a couple of centuries. So breakthroughs, but not widely transmitted knowledge, not recopied manuscripts insofar as we know, and not printed. So what we can see then overall is the emergence then, with the exception of a few breakthroughs, the emergence of a generic idol. The Buddha as merely as But, as idol, or indeed of one of many asnam in the Arabic language of idols. The loss or absence of specificity, whether in, and especially in idolography. And this is an irony, because what we might say is in the most cosmopolitan, the most sympathetic literary expressions writing about idols, by poets, for example, the poets are much less concerned with the specificity of an idol being attached to particular beliefs or practices and having a particular name and a particular community around them than the harissiographers, who weren't in that sense cosmopolitan or sympathetic. They're opposed to Sajad al-Sanam, a prostration before idols, as being the very opposite of Islam. And yet it was nonetheless the harissiographers who collected much more specific data. So perhaps an irony, or I don't know what it is, but again, an interesting point of fact as far as I'm aware of the primary sources. The most abundant or site-specific references to idols then appear to have been in India, perhaps unsurprising for various sort of demographic and literary reasons. And we do have a cosmopolitan focus on theological similarity then in some cases, particularly Dara Shikoh, of course. But again, here we have to bear in mind here too that when we have this cosmopolitan focus, it's actually Dara Shikoh is actually making the case that the Muwahidun-i-Hind, as he calls them, the Unitarians of India, that's to say Hindus of whom he approves, they can be approved of specifically because they're Unitarians. They worship one God or divine unity. They're not But Parastan, they're not idol worshippers. So again, when we get into the intellectual and theological specifics of even a sort of a cosmopolitan embrace of Hindus, it's not including, in inverted commas, idol worship, but parasti. And then, well, how is this the case? Well, again, we have to kind of think in terms of the bigger intellectual context within South Asia, as well as beyond, of these major intellectual barriers of geography, of script, and of language, of different writing systems, different languages, very, of course, highly technical languages of Buddhist philosophy, etc. And of course, we also have to bear in mind too that within India itself, even Buddhist texts that are written in Sanskrit had long disappeared. So when in the 19th, later 19th and 20th century, when the Indian literature of Buddhism and the Indian Sanskrit texts are found, they're not found in India. They're found in libraries, particularly in Kathmandu, in Tibet, or surviving in Chinese translations. So for all sorts of reasons, this absence of knowledge, when we actually look closely and think carefully, it's not surprising. It would be more surprising if somehow knowledge of a specific Buddha and the teachings and practices surrounding him and his followers and the various different schools of Buddhism, it'd be rather surprising if that had somehow survived and been handed on. Hence, then, the process of memory loss and of forgetting were on the assumption of continuity that I want to point to. Similarly, then, the bigger methodological takeaway that I want to put out there for listeners is the danger then of the assumption of continuous memory is actually, when we think about it, an assumption of particular texts, necessarily in manuscript form before the 19th century, and printing spreads in South Asia and the Islamic world. We have to assume it's a flawed assumption that texts, particular texts, such as Rashid ad-Din's account of Shakyamuni, the Buddha, or the Aini Akbari, the assumption that those manuscripts were copied, that were passed on, etc., etc. And we have methods to test this and check this, looking at different when copies were made, colophons, of course, that tell us about where and when and for whom perhaps they were copied, ownership marks, citations of works in other works, etc., etc. But my initial findings, at least with regard to some of these key texts, Ibn Battuta, Rashid ad-Din, and drawing on the work of more capable scholars such as Stefan Kamola, in Rashid ad-Din's case, it's not very encouraging. I think there was much more a process then of memory loss. Before then, this print rediscovery of building on the title of the rediscovery of the Islamic classics then by Ahmad al-Shamsi, then what I'm calling the rediscovery of the Islamicate classics, then Muslim books written about non-Muslims. So the Islamicate Buddha then rediscovered in print. So Rashid ad-Din's Jami Tawarikh is first printed in Paris in 1833. It's then printed in Kazan, 1841, in the Russian Empire. But from Kazan then, text then, the interest there then is Rashid ad-Din's account of, let's say, of Eurasia, and the background, there's an interest there in the Tatars and their own history. But these reprints then, whether the Paris or the Kazan ones, don't have the crucial Indian volume, which has Shakyamuni, not till the Leiden edition of 1911. Now, there is a Persian edition printed in the Middle East. I've never found an Indian edition of Rashid ad-Din then in the 19th century. The one edition I can find anywhere in, let's say, the Islamic world or in South Asia then is, as I say, an edition that's printed in the 1930s in Tehran. But we can't assume, there I have it there, the 1934 edition of Bahman Karimi. But as far as I'm aware, that too doesn't have the Indian edition, because Karimi and his readers are more interested in what Rashid ad-Din had to say about Iran than he did their own history. So 1855, as I hinted earlier, Sayyid Ahmad Khan puts the Aini Akbari into print, and then we have the Jami Usmani, the Hyderabad edition of the 1930s. So again, this is a caesura of 2.5 centuries when we can't assume the manuscript was copied. Ibn Battuta then is first printed in Paris. So this is when we first then start to have evidence then of Ibn Battuta's previously the manuscript copies that are only there in the Maghrebi script, that's to say, only been copied at least, perhaps even only circulated in the North Africa and the Islamic West. Then we have the 1850s Orientalist edition in Paris, then a Cairo edition, a Mukhtasar, a short version, a 1870 reedition, and then finally an Urdu translation in 1898. So Ibn Battuta's reception is really a modern phenomenon, in short. And Ibn Battuta is becoming a source of information, particularly information for Muslims about the wider world, is really a modern phenomenon that is hand in glove with the Orientalist discovery as well. I have an article out about this, about the role of Ibn Battuta among the Sri Lankan Muslims and about the Sri Lankan Muslim, the more reconstruction of their identity as being Arabs through the translation and the publication of Ibn Battuta in English by the Royal Asiatic Society Ceylon branch as well. So Ibn Battuta has this big impact in the Islamic world and among Muslims worldwide and indeed non-Muslim readers, but this is really a modern phenomenon. In 1905, and I'm drawing on here on I think I'm drawing on here on Ahmad Shamsi's work with Ahmad Zaki Pasha, then an Egyptian and Ottoman Orientalist, then announces that he's found the sole manuscript of Al-Kalbi's 9th century Book of Idols in Damascus. Announces that at the 16th Congress of Orientalists. So again, that ancient, most detailed early text about idols in Arabic, a theological text or at least hagiographical text, then is again its wider reception from that sole surviving known manuscript then is a modern phenomenon. And similar, those Burmese to Persian translations then were unique manuscripts in the Asic Society of Bengal in Calcutta. So what I'm pointing to here again methodologically is beyond Sayyidinism, what I'm calling this new Eurasian intellectual history, in which we're seeing European, Arab, Iranian, Indian, Muslim, Hindu, all sorts, Sri Lankan scholars, intellectuals, sort of learning from one another in a much more entangled process rather than some dichotomy of paths of learning. And again, I'll point again to these sort of more of recent works looking at this sort of in regions beyond South Asia. So just I'll take another perhaps 10 minutes, take us up to 50 minutes then with the South Asian rediscovery of Buddha. So I'd earlier mentioned then this text that first got me puzzling, this Urdu account of Burma from the late 19th century, in which the very learned North Indian author from the regions of the historical Buddha comes to Burma with no conception of a person called Buddha, of a religion called Buddhism, and even after spending many years there, still comes away talking about this is simply called the religion of Burma, the Mazhabi Burma. There's no mention of a figure called Buddha. We have Gautama, obviously related to what we would now immediately recognize. Well, that's Gautama the Buddha. But the striking thing then is that our very learned, even Burmese reading Indian Muslim author doesn't recognize this Gautama as anything to do with the Buddha or Bud or But, if he's indeed heard of Bud, and explicitly writes in his text that this Gautama is probably from China. He's probably born in China. But as we can see here from these texts in the background, he's writing among this wider Muslim interest, South Asian Muslim interest, indeed wider South Asian interest in Burma, if not necessarily in the religions and cultures of Burma. So Abdul Khaliq's book then, ultimately, this is again one of these ironies. He's not a cosmopolitan figure in the sense that he's not drawing equations or equalities between what he calls the religion of Burma, what we would call Buddhism, and Islam, quite the opposite. Yet nonetheless, in as part to persuade through the use of reason and evidence, through what he calls tahqiq, through research and indeed the search for truth, to be literal translation, even though he's trying to convert Burmese to Islam, he's nonetheless, and he's not then a cosmopolitan figure writing nicely about idols, etc. It's that drive that makes him, more than any other South Asian Muslim or otherwise scholar I've now know of this of his period, perhaps. I suppose there are a few others who his younger contemporaries, I suppose. Kosambi, who we might talk about later, who converts to Buddhism. But he is actually far more concerned with learning the texts themselves, the language, and indeed the beliefs. But nonetheless, this isn't cosmopolitan, but it's nonetheless what I call humanistic. It's a theological humanism because he believes that the people of Burma are endowed with reason, they're fully human, they have reason, and they can weigh up the evidence then, including their fully developed moral beings, that can be persuaded by his theological arguments that Tanasukh, so the old harusigraphical language, or simply the term for reincarnation, brings about all these moral problems, such as what happens when an example he gives, what happens when you and your daughter are reincarnated and you fall in love and marry your daughter in a future life. This is morally troubling. So how can this be logically or indeed ethically acceptable as a theological belief for a rational human being? So staying with Burma, what struck me is, what are we talking about here? Yeah, 28 years on, we have another text by another North Indian Maulvi, another North Indian religious scholar. It's a travelogue, plain and simple. And in this text here, things have changed a great deal. Sayyid Abu Zafar Nadvi, himself a Muslim theologian, now writes, page 33, I'll sort of quote, how did what he now calls the Buddhism, the religion or the Dharma, the religion of Buddha, so of a specific Buddha now, how did the religion of Buddha come to Burma? And he writes then, Hindustan, India, is the cradle of the Buddha Mazhab. India is the cradle of the Buddha religion, of the Buddhist religion. And then he goes on to say, well, there are various answers to how this religion that's originally from India came to Burma. Some say it came from China, since through the Shan people of the north, who are also ruled by China, who are also Buddhists. Some say it came from India via Assam, etc. So this pushed me to ask how, with a fellow North Indian Muslim theologian, a fellow Maulvi, fellow religious scholar writing in Urdu, how do they have how is it that Nadvi has access to such different, more specific information? Well, here I'll just kind of whiz through these slides, and I talk about this much more detail in my book, How Asia Found Herself, if anybody's interested in following up. But effectively, from the 1890s onwards, and particularly the 1900s, and really gathering pace in the 1920s, we have a whole series of works in Indian languages, in Urdu, in particular, also in Bangla, there on the left, a whole series of works on this specific Buddhism, on the historical Buddha. And these are drawing on, for example, of Rhys Davids, of course, the famous scholar of Ceylonese Buddhism and scholar of Pali, the work of F. Max Muller. It's actually F. Max Muller, the German Oxford-based scholar, his translation of the Dhammapada into English, that gets translated into Urdu and into Bangla. Sir Thomas Arnold, his famous, very positive, but nonetheless Christological, Christ-like depiction of the Buddha in his famous long poem, The Light of Asia, gets translated into many Indian languages, as well as Japanese and other languages of Buddhist Asia too, passing on a very Christian depiction of the Buddha and a very positive depiction of the Buddha. And then such that we can see this slide on the right, by the 1910s, we have here even images then of the Buddha Kabut, so the idol of the Buddha. So the terms Bud and But have now been separated. So the statue of the Buddha or the idol of the Buddha as it's found in Japan, or as it's found there in Tibet and India. So we're getting this specifics then. Similarly, then in other works, whether more, let's say, kind of more locally written works, a history of the Deccan there, with an image there, picture of Bud, of course, relating here to the caves at Alora, in this history of the Deccan, Tarikh Deccan. And on the right here, a book again, which is really reflecting these, not just Eurasian, but now including American transmissions of knowledge of Buddhism. Not surprising when we think of the travels of, for example, Dhammapala, the great Ceylonese reviver of Buddhism, whose own career as a Buddhist missionary is predicated on his, let's say, his apprenticeship with Colonel Olcott of the New York-based Theosophical Society. And then we have a text here on the right, Buddha and his mat, Buddha and his way, let's say, his religious way, his path. And this book is a translation into Urdu of a book by Charles Strauss, who in 1893, who was a Jewish American, who in 1893 converts to Buddhism at the World Parliament of Religions at the hands of Dhammapala. And then his book in 1926 is translated into Urdu, describing more than and here we have the full statement of that, translated, etc. So again, this sort of really complex kind of Ceylonese theosophical, Jewish, American, now kind of Indian Muslim, and indeed wider, many obviously not only Sikhs and Hindus, of course, widely read Urdu still in this period too. Afghanistan, of course, a land of historical Buddhism, but think about it now, the Bamiyan Buddhas. For those who are interested in following this up, I just sort of point to an article I wrote with Nushin Ababzadeh in the Journal of the American Oriental Society. But following there too, even in the 1870s and 80s, then we have a report here on Badakhshan, here then on as being, this is still accounts whether from the Mughal period of 1582, of Akbar's attempt to invade Kafiristan, what later becomes called Nuristan, now northeastern Afghanistan. Later Afghan accounts here, the earliest Afghan newspaper, in fact, from the 1870s, the public sphere. This is still a record, only the generic idol. Even here, text from the 1890s then, of the idols then, the same language is being used to describe the statues of very distinct and particular gods of the peoples of so-called Kafiristan, what later becomes Nuristan when it's conquered in the 1890s. We have Indian printed works by Afghan authors, which celebrate then the destruction of buts, of idols. And even here we have about the Buddhas of Bamiyan. Here we have an account in Sharaf, a Tehran printed newspaper, with these images then of the Buddhas of Bamiyan. But here too, they're described as still as just being the red idol, the red Butt, the Soch and the King Butt, the red and white idols. Terms that go back to the Hudud al-Alam, a 10th century pioneering Persian geographical work, with the more specific information coming from Captain, later Sir Alexander Burns' account of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, where these images appeared. They get transmitted to Russia, then into Iran, and come out in 1885 in this late afterlife. But still, there's no language of a specific Buddhist religion in Iran any more than India in this period. Even in the 1910s, when the great Afghan historian Khatib Hazara publishes the main volumes in 1912 of his Siraj al-Tawarikh, his Torch of Histories, we still have there, and I also quote from that, from Robert McChesney's translation. In the text as a whole, McChesney tells me there are 24 uses of the word but, including, for example, the description of how Field Marshal Ghulam Haydar Khan sent to Kabul 19 wooden idols, wooden butts from the people of Kafiristan, etc., etc. And they were kept as souvenirs of the conquest of Kafiristan. These are indeed the what still survive in the Kabul Museum today, which were originally taken as booty then, because, as Khatib Hazada, the historian, explains, they were kept as souvenirs of the conquest of Kafiristan, and from this point on, it's fitting to remember His Majesty Abdurrahman Khan by the nickname Idol Smasher, Butcher Khan. But by the 1920s, then, I read about this in an article, The Afghan Discovery of Buddha, I think it's called. We have a really important Afghan scholar, later the director of the Kabul Museum, the first director of the Afghan Historical Society, working together with French archaeologists. There he is with Jean Cal at Bamiyan in the late 1920s, for whom he worked as translator. And then Kozad then collects oral legends of the region of Bamiyan in the late 20s, from which we know that in the local region, there was no memory of a specific Buddhist religion there, not in the folk memory. And yet by the 1930s then and thereafter, Kozad and other Afghan scholars start writing about what he's calling here San'ati Yunano Budai, literally translating the terminology of French scholars then of Greco-Buddhist art. So this recognition then, a world historical, if you like, or archaeological approach to Buddhism. But then this is, again, this kind of set of collaborations that I'm hinting at there with the image of Kozad and Jean Cal. So yeah, by the 1930s, 40s, we have the Buddhas of Bamiyan and Afghan stamps, as well as, of course, the Ashokan image on the Indian flag. Different claims then to Buddha, nationalist claims of Afghans and Indians. But again, this is part of a self-discovery, of a nationalist self-discovery of the deep civilizational past of these competing nation states by the mid-20th century. I will leave it here then, just give you a few images we might bring up in the conversation. Matteo Ricci's account of China being translated from Latin into Persian and then finally published in India in the 1880s and 90s. Accounts of China coming up through Karkaran Sahib, who's an Irish translator of the East India Company, who actually draws on Ibn Battuta, Rashiduddin, and others from the French and English translations, puts sections of them into Urdu, recognizing the Buddha in China and Lanka then, so beyond India, but Buddhist accounts then, Indian accounts of a Buddhist Sri Lanka in particular here at the bottom. And indeed then, what we would now take as given, the shared Silk Road history then, of connections through Buddhism between India and China, a major theme of particularly Bengali Asianists in the 20s and 30s. But again, these complicated intellectual histories, the travels of Xuanzang, in this case, the 7th century Chinese Buddhist pilgrim to India, whose travelogue, of course, creates a map for Cunningham and others to archaeologically rediscover the historical Buddha and Buddhist sites in India. And that text then is translated from Chinese into French and then from French into English by a Reverend Beale, and Reverend Beale's account then is translated into Urdu and published in 1921, allowing Indian readers then, or Indian vernacular readers then, to rediscover their Buddhist connections with China. But this is a very late, not even rediscovery, I would say, perhaps even a discovery. The Japanese examples too, reaching further aside. And I'll finish here with this quotation that takes us back to the beginning, where I began, with the Quranic text and modern interpretations then, with the commentary of the Syrian reformist Jamaluddin al-Qasimi. And he's commenting down on a part of the Quran, Surah At-Tin, which had long puzzled exegetes for more than 1,000 years. The section particularly وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ وَطُورِ سِينِينَ وَهَذَا الْبَلَادِ أَمِينَ. I swear by the fig and the olive and Mount Sinai that this city made secure. Well, the other parts then, the olive, a reference to the olive trees of Jerusalem, therefore to Jesus, Mount Sinai, a reference to Moses, and this city made secure, a reference to Medina, a reference to Muhammad. Exegetes had long recognized that for 1,300 years. But Qasimi then, in the 1910s, with this transmission, including into Arabic from, it seems, from American transcendentalist accounts of Buddhism that went into the Arabic Encyclopedia, published by Al-Bastani in Beirut. We have now this recognition, or then an interpretation, that the fig tree here is, of course, the Ficus religiosa, the Bodhi tree, the Buddhist fig tree, and the Quran, and indeed God then must have been speaking here of the Buddha, and therefore as the Buddha, not as the ultimate heretic, but as one of the other prophets then put here alongside Jesus, Moses, and Muhammad. I've gone on as long as one might have done, or indeed beyond, but I'll finish there, and I think we still have the best part of, I think, half an hour or so for a conversation and questions. Thank you for being with me.